Great morning, world! Welcome to the Rise Up with Dragon podcast with your host, Dragon!
Get into the float state with Calm Mind meditations and gear.
All right, welcome to the Rise Up with Dragon show, Mr. Rizwan Virk. So pleased and honored to have you here with us today.
Great to be here with you.
Yeah. And where are you located right now? Where are you living?
Well, depends on the time of year, but in the summer I'm in Boston, and then at other times I'm either in Arizona at ASU where I'm doing some doctoral work, or in the Silicon Valley in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Interesting choice of locations. So what I'd love to do, first and foremost, I just want to let you know, I mean, my followers know a lot about this. I talk a lot about simulation hypothesis and it's also leading into the current reality of like the potential duplication of it ourselves with the metaverse and everything like that. But I found Rizwan's work, and he's an extraordinary individual. We're going to go in a little bit into his past, but I was reading a little bit up on the amazing Philip K. Dick, and I learned about this really cool guy that did an interview with his wife, and it was just really, and then that was a pivotal part of your journey as well. But anyway, I found these two books that I've already highlighted on my show many times, specifically Simulation Hypothesis and Simulation Multiverse. And I was explaining to him in the pregame that, reading his books is kind of like eating pizza, in the sense that, like, I don't usually just eat a slice of pizza. I usually like to eat the whole pie. So, I just devoured these books, and I'm so excited to finally get to meet the guy that wrote them. So, Rizwan, if you could, I want to go a little bit into your past, specifically, your MIT days, and then when you came out of there with this, desire to get into the video gaming, industry from the programming perspective. I mean, this guy's done a lot of stuff. You heard that in the intro. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I'd love to tee it up, where your fascination for this simulation hypothesis came from, and make sure we get that ping pong story in there.
Sure. Well, my fascination with this idea of living inside a video game started, back when I was young. And, I'm old enough that I used to play the Atari video game system, back in the early 80s as a kid. And we had classic games like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and there was a racing game called Pole Position. And I remember looking at the track, and as the car went around the track, there were these bleachers, and then there would be mountains or a city beyond. And I always wondered what was beyond the screen that I could see. Like, was there a virtual world in there? And of course, there wasn't with those Atari games. Those were 8-bit, very simple games. And, later when I went to MIT and learned all about programming, I learned more about, how these games were built. And of course, games got more sophisticated with Nintendo. They became 16-bit games. And then, after graduating, I was an entrepreneur, started a few enterprise software companies, which, is a little more boring. But then I moved to Silicon Valley and got in the video game industry when the mobile device was becoming the new popular platform, right? So, the iPhone had just come out, and we made a game called Tap Fish, which was the #1 game in the App Store back in the day. And we were creating this little world where the fish would live, inside the game. And I started to learn more about how these video games were built and how they were designed. And, today we have massively, multiplayer online role-playing games like Fortnite on the phone. But back then it was very difficult to get information on 3G out to the phone. And so I started to think about it a little more, but it was really after I sold my last video game company. I was visiting a startup in Marin County, which is just across the bay from San Francisco. And so, I had this beautiful view of the San Francisco skyline, but the people that were there, like myself, we were all geeks, so we wanted to see the latest technology. And there was this virtual reality headset and game that they were building. So we put on the VR headset, and I was playing this ping pong game. And, the game was so realistic that I forgot that I was actually in virtual reality. And it wasn't even the graphics. Like the graphics were still kind of crude by today's standards. This was back in like 2016, I think. But it was the responsiveness of, when I moved the paddle, it really felt like I was hitting a ball. So it was really the physics engine and the responsiveness that fooled my brain into thinking that, I was actually playing a real table tennis game. So much so that at the end of the game, I tried to put the paddle down on the table, and then I tried to lean against the table. And of course, there was no table. And the controller fell to the floor, and I almost fell over. And I had to kind of do a double take. And that's when I started to wonder, well, how long will it be before we can build fully immersive technology that will make us completely forget that we are in the real world? I mean, obviously, I knew I had a VR headset on at the time, but I still kind of forgot. And so I came up with these 10 stages of technology development, which, by the way, pretty much looks like, the roadmap of the metaverse as Meta and other companies, want to make it. But that's how I got deeply into this topic, as I explored these stages to figure out when would we get to what I call the simulation point, which is the point at which we could create virtual worlds that were indistinguishable from physical worlds. And then that led to, opening up a whole host of philosophical issues around quantum physics. I had also done a lot of meditation and yoga in the past. And so I was interested in consciousness, and I realized that this topic, simulation theory, actually ties science, technology, consciousness, these big questions from religion, all together. And so that's what led me really deep down this rabbit hole. And actually interviewing, Philip K. Dick's wife, Tessa, was a part of that. I knew he had a famous speech in Metz, France in 1977, where he said, we are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed. We would have the sense that we were reliving the same events again and again. And so he was one of the first in the modern era to really talk about the world being some type of computer program or simulation.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to hear that story, because what it unfolds is that this is all based on curiosity. And one of the things that I find very interesting about this concept, and some people are closed to it. You mentioned religion before. A lot of my observation is that somebody that's closed to this and says that's impossible, which means that they've never actually looked into it, right? If somebody says this is impossible, they just don't understand what possible means. Because what's so fascinating about this work is that it can't be disproved, right? So from that platform, that's where my interest is that I'm open to anything that is hypothetically possible, hence the name hypothesis, But what's interesting about, all of this concept of curiosity from when you saw and I remember pole position. I'm 51, and I had Atari.
Same age, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm kind of in the same boat where I'm curious, and I look at all these things, and what I find is interesting about it. And if you have something to say on this, I'd love you to speak to this, is the whole concept of perception that human beings have, plays a big role in the outcome of our life. If we have this programmed perception to, think things are as we see them, and we're not open to the hypothesis that you're talking about, we will rely on our knee-jerk reactions, all the time. But what I love about your book, and I don't know if you've ever looked at your book as a tool to empower human beings from a personal growth standpoint, but I just want to share that when you go through these 10 stages and you look at this idea of reaching the simulation point, and you just open yourself up to it, what it does is it arms you with the ability to not buy into everything that you see and think that it could be something else. So are you aware of that from a personal growth, self-development standpoint, like that idea of empowering people with this possibility?
Yeah, I have thought about that, because the questions that I often get asked, when I speak about it, first are, how can I prove it's real or not? And that opens up a whole rabbit hole. But then the next question they often get is, okay, how does this matter to me, right? Would it make a difference if I was in a simulation or not? And some people say, well, I'd be afraid if this was a simulation. I'd be terrified that I'm just some AI wandering around in this virtual world, and I have no control over anything, and I have no free will. And so, some of the more traditional religious people I talk to first object to the simulation hypothesis from that perspective. But then when I go into a little more detail and I say, well, there's what I call two versions of the simulation hypothesis. They're not really completely different versions. It's more like a spectrum. There's the NPC version, which is the non-player character version, where everyone in the game is an AI or an NPC, is what we call them within video games. And then there's the RPG version, or the role-playing game version, where just as, when I play World of Warcraft, I have an avatar and I define that character, just like, we used to do with Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, which is, popular again because of Stranger Things, right? You have a character sheet and you say, okay, these are the different attributes that I have. But then you inhabit that role for a period of time. And so in that case, you are a player of the game. You are consenting to be in the game. And I believe that can be very empowering because, particularly when big challenges come into our life, right? And so the guy who created, the Atari and really the first major video games, that were widely available was Nolan Bushnell, founder of Atari. And I met him, a few years back. And, he had this phrase that he used to use with his game designers. And he said, the game should be easy to play, but hard to master, right? And I think that's a great metaphor for the game of life. It's easy to play, but it's not so, it can be difficult to master. And, when you play a video game, you have to have these challenges. Otherwise, you'll get bored with the game, right? And so these challenges are actually a key part of what makes the game interesting. And if you don't make the challenge the first time, well, you can go do it again and you can keep playing at the game until you get there. And so, when bad things happen to us, it can be a different perspective that can be pretty empowering to think that we have, each of us has characters and storylines. I'm a big fan of the personal growth field, but sometimes I feel like, we lose the perspective that perhaps each of us has multiple storylines that we have planned. If I'm playing, Grand Theft Auto versus Lord of the Rings online, I'm looking for a different type of experience, right? And, in my case, I've always been drawn to computers and computer programming and video games. And I knew that was always a part of my storyline. But I also had the sense, if you asked me when I was a kid, I'd say, well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and then I'm going to become a writer. And now, how did I know that? Right? I almost feel that we have these possible storylines, not that they're fixed, but they are adventures that we might want to have. And then sometimes, we need to be pulled back from what we're doing because we're missing out on some storyline that we were supposed to be working on, but we didn't necessarily get there. And I'll share a story with you. I haven't talked about this too much, but it ties directly to my writing these books. And so I spent most of my career as an entrepreneur and an investor and a venture capitalist. And we've invested in some well-known companies like Discord, which many people use today. But the writing was more of a hobby, and I was sort of pushing it off. And then a few years back, actually about 4 years ago now, I ended up having some serious medical issues related to the heart. And it basically upset my entire plan for what I was going to do next. And I found myself in a very long recovery period from this surgery. And I basically couldn't do all the things that I was planning to do in my mind. I was going to start a venture capital fund and do all of these things. And basically the only thing I could do was write for a while. And so, this tragedy that kind of upset what I thought I wanted actually ended up having a higher purpose and guided me back to something I've always wanted to do, but I just wasn't spending enough time on, which was much more meaningful to me, which is my writing. And so pretty much the last 4 years, mostly I've been a writer, and then the business stuff has been kind of my hobby on the side. So it flipped. And so, there's an example where if we think of the game of life and the storylines that we're here to play, we can get a different perspective thinking of simulation theory.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at any components of personal growth, there's all these amazing quotes that if you're open to it, lend to everything that you just said. Like, one of them that comes to mind right now is this idea that if you change the way you look at things you look at change. So you could say that to a room full of people and they all get it. They'll say, oh yeah, so words of affirmation and all of these laws of the universe that for some reason people buy into. But then when you say something like this, like, hey, this is potentially, a simulation, and there's a kid in some sort of advanced civilization with a laptop and a program called Planet Earth, and everything is programmed into that. That's where all of a sudden I think it's rooted in our programming from our mother, father, teacher, preacher, and our religions and all that stuff. One of the things that we've always done in our family is embrace all religions, almost like we're devouring and consuming personal growth, just because they all have such cool little things. One of the things that really attracted me to this, and even as a kid, I was just an observer. And I know that you speak a lot about this. And what's fascinating to me is, like, why are some people, so like if this is a simulation and it's been programmed, right? And let's just hypothetically say that we are all some sort of like advanced AI that is so advanced we don't even know that we're AI, right? Why are some people gifted perhaps with the ability to see and be open to things in the simulation, and some are not? This is an interesting concept for me. Like, you and I, we could go out and have a couple drinks and talk about this all night and just have a ball with it. But popularity, the masses would actually reject it. And I know that it's because they're rooted in it. But why in the simulation, and I don't know if you can answer this, but why in the simulation have certain people been gifted with a level of consciousness to the possibility that it exists and some aren't?
Well, that's a good question, and not one that's easily answered. But, my sense is that the more we play, the more, we become conscious of the meta game, right? So it's like when you play a video game, the first time you're just trying to master the mechanics of what's in the video game. But as you start to realize more about how things are put together, there's something we call the meta game, right? So within a card collecting game, right, there's, people are sharing cards, but they kind of step back and say, okay, what is this really about? And what are the other things that, make up this game that are not in what I call the rendered world? So, I think that, those of us who are more curious about it have been playing the game, but we now have played it enough times with enough challenges and quests, right? Another aspect of this personal development and tying it to a simulation or a video game is that we may have quests that we have to overcome. And that's how video games are built. Otherwise they get boring, right? And you have to accept those quests and move up on those quests. And it could just be that the quests that, most people have signed up for are just the quests around, daily life, survival, nuts and bolts, which of course has its satisfaction and its happiness as well. And there could be those of us who decided, okay, well, now there's these other quests called thinking about, the nature of things and moving beyond things. And so I think that has something to do with it as well. But, I don't know that there's any particular pattern you can discern on that, right? Sometimes people get there from being really successful in the physical world, and sometimes people get there from, not being very successful in the physical and stepping back, right? I think it's more about stepping back, really, and trying to get a perspective of not just what's on the screen, right? It's kind of like in that scene in The Matrix, right, where when Morpheus, who's named after the Greek god of dreams, finally gets Neo to wake up, and then he puts him in a little simulation, right? Which, if you remember, there's a famous scene where there's like a kind of a red chair and he's sitting on it, and there's a white background, and he's like, whoa, Neo's like, whoa, is this real? And Morpheus says, well, what is real? Reality is really a series of electromagnetic signals that are being sent to your brain. And so I think, those of us who have thought about being in a slightly different version of things would be more likely or more open to thinking about this, I think,
Yeah, I find it interesting. And folks, when you read books like this, it's probably going to be prompted by you having some sort of curiosity and fascination with it. But if that fascination and curiosity has just been awoken, his books, and I hope that I can call you Riz at this
Yeah,
point.
yeah, please do. Yeah.
His books are very, very deep, but also very easy to understand because he takes the time to go through the stages. So I highly recommend, like, one of your first steps, if you want to go down this rabbit hole, would be to check that out. But one of the things that I'm very fascinated with, because it's one thing to identify that this is a simulation, and my concept behind that is, so what? Whether it is or isn't, it's what I think is real, and accepting it as a simulation is just saying my real is simulation, and I'm fine with it. Like, I was walking with my wife this morning, and we always joke whenever because we're all about, like, not letting anybody dampen our fire. So whenever we meet somebody that maybe has a bad look on their face or road rage or anything like that, we always call them cartoons. We always say, oh, they don't even exist, which can get you in trouble, by the way.
Right.
But then my wife will challenge me and she'll go, well, then, so are you saying I'm not real? And I go, well, that depends. Like Morpheus said to Neo, that depends on what real is. But I just want you to know that whatever you are, I like it. That's what I say to my wife.
Well,
so-
I had a friend who came to me one day and she said, I think my husband's an NPC. And I said, well, let's not go down that route too far, because if you imagine a multiplayer game, then your husband is also a player who has his or her storyline, right? Each of our storylines are evolving together, and that's what an MMORPG is all about. But sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No, you're absolutely right. And when we say that people are cartoons, what I'm saying is oh, those are just NPCs. You can choose to interact with them or not. Because one of the things that I notice in the program, in the simulation, is that certain people are susceptible to everything that the NPCs have to say, and certain people have the ability to not render them. Perhaps, it's like they don't, like, if somebody that's got their shit together in life, and and really focused on what they want and what they can and can't control. And that's something that I practice a lot. I don't notice the NPCs as much as other people. So it's interesting to think about what level of control we have, because I would assume that if I'm AI, something about my programming and my advancedness of AI give me the ability to control what I see and what I don't see.
Well, yeah. Well, now you get to the levels of the AI, right? And if you think of a video game, you can think of level 5 characters versus level 50 characters in that game. And level 50 characters, like, if I have a level 5 character, I might be in a scene with you, and you're a level 50 character. You might see things that I can't see, right? And they're just rendered inside your particular rendering device. Just like today, we're not really having a conversation right now, right? I am talking to my computer, and your responses are being rendered on my local computer, and my responses are being rendered on your local computer.
Who's the NPC here?
I prefer to think of it as the MMORPG version, right? Where each of us has our own storylines evolving, and we're interacting with each other. And that's one of the things that's going on. Another way to approach it is to say, what is this NPC trying to tell me, right? Are they trying to get a reaction from me, right? If there's a road rage or something, are they trying to get me to yell back at them, right? What is actually, if this were an NPC, not necessarily saying that everybody is, but why is it coming to me at this point in time? And when, how do I level up from this interaction?
Yeah, that you just made me think of the Hunger Games and Katniss Everdeen, and how the people would float down some sort of elixir or something to heal her. That's an example of that, because there's another perspective to this. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, looking at this possibility, and we haven't even gotten into the multiverse, because I don't want to, like, have people, like, hemorrhage and melt their brains yet, but like, the multiverse would be the idea that this is actually happening multiple times in multiple realities. Like, I was telling my wife the other day, and I'm like, another level of this, she didn't like this, was the idea that there's another reality where you and I didn't meet, and all that stuff. But what's fascinating to think about, and this is a question I have for you, is and this would just be getting your opinion on it. There's not going to be any science behind this, just somebody that's done a lot of the work. Taking into account that this is a simulation, and taking into account and accepting the fact of what our role potentially would be, right? Whether we're an NPC or, role player game or whatever, just being open to the fact that we might be one of those things. It then starts to, because when you look at the idea of rendering, and I'll talk about that in a second, that kind of explains what consciousness might be, right? Different levels, right? But what is our purpose? What I'd love to dig into your mind is, like, from all the work that you've done, what's your hypothesis? Like, the next book should be like our purpose hypothesis in the simulation or something. Like,
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I do get asked it. Why would somebody make a simulation? Why would somebody be in a simulation? And I always say, well, think back to, why do we run simulations, and why do we play video games, right? And so when we run simulations, we try to see what will happen. We want to know what is the likely outcome, but we also want to know what is the best outcome. So simulations of the weather, we're trying to figure out, with all these factors, what will happen. Pandemic, modeling and simulation, we're trying to figure out what would happen with these variables. But the only way that type of simulation is useful is if you run it multiple times, right? And so you run it multiple times to see what might be the likely outcome. And so that ties into this idea of the multiverse, and with Philip K. Dick. And actually, originally I thought his famous statement in that Met speech was about being in a computer program simulation, and it sort of was and wasn't. And that's why I wrote the second book. Actually, was what he was really talking about was changing variables and rerunning the simulation, as if, you said you would be saying the same words, hearing the same words. You'd have feelings of deja vu, that some of these things might have happened before. And, his wife told me that he came to believe The Man in the High Castle, which is a popular series on Amazon now. It was his kind of best received book while he was alive, about the Germans and the Japanese winning World War II. He came to believe that that was a real timeline that ran forward, and then they came back, and then they ran it forward with different parameters so that the Allies won the war. And perhaps this is a better outcome than that. Although who knows, we may just be in another branch. So that's one aspect of what's the purpose of the simulation. But the second question that I often say is, why do we play video games? Well, we play them to have experiences that we can't have outside the game. And some might say in the real world, but I put that in quotes because, we may be in a game, but, I can't fly around on a dragon and shoot orcs in this physical world. That's not the nature of this game, right? But I can do that, within a video game. I could be an NBA star. I could have, if in The Sims, people have experiences, they have relationships, they get married, they have kids, right? There are all these different experiences. And there was a virtual world called Second Life that was sort of Metaverse 1.0 back in 2007 when it was really popular. I spent a lot of time in it just observing what people did. And I was surprised at the depth of the social relationships. It's like, oh, well, they wanted to go have this experience of being a Star Trek character, or visiting a BDSM module, or, having a relationship and being married to somebody else, or having a job. And they would literally have to show up every night to work at this, as a bartender in this virtual bar inside Second Life, and they'd get paid. But it was like they treated it as real in some ways as the physical reality. And so the idea is, perhaps there are experiences that we can have here that we can't have outside the simulation. And that's actually what some of the religious people have been telling us, right? That this is in the Quran, for example, there is a statement about this whole thing is a kind of game that we have set up for you to play so you can amuse yourselves and do various things. And then, of course, that ties to other aspects like the reviewing what you did in the game and the life review. We can talk about that if you want, or we can go in a different direction. I think you're muted. I can't hear you.
Sorry about that. That was supposed to happen.
That was a glitch in the matrix.
Well, and that's one of the things I want to get into right now. But what's so fascinating, I'm looking at my notes, and like I realized that there's no way I could ask you another 40 questions. But there's so many just different components to this. But to respect time, yours and everybody else's. One thing I want to get into is this idea, because I said, I've always noticed something strange about myself, that I always found that I was an observer, meaning, the masses would have said, my parents would say something like my head was in the clouds, right? But I always found myself looking at things differently, like looking at architecture and things like that. And at some point in my life, what I realized that I was doing was that I was looking for glitches. I was curious, like, what the hell is all of this? You know what I mean? Like, why am I looking at this when everybody's looking over there? So for me, I have my own impressions. Some of them, if I explain them, might get me locked up, but I started to notice weird things. And, some standard ones would be like the Mandela effect, and, look up the Mandela effect, watch the movie, but Riz does a great job of reminding us of all of these weird things that we might have just let go by us that affected us, like different names and things like that. But things like deja vu, Mandela effect, or even just like this idea of like how sometimes, people talk about the flow state right now, but part of the flow state is losing track of time, and then there's the whole concept of time. So talk a little bit about, because this is where the research is, in order to prove this, we would have to prove that there's glitches, because if there's glitches, that's the platform we can say, hey, what's going on here? So just talk a little bit about, that kind of stuff. I mean, what I want to ask you is, why does that stuff happen? But it does kind of support this, doesn't it?
Yeah, I became curious about different types of glitches. And, I wrote a book a few years ago called Treasure Hunt, which is about following the clues to find true success. And the clues in this case, that was a term that I used for things like synchronicity, right? And synchronicity is when you have an inner event and an outer event, and they correspond in ways that can't be explained logically. And then, it's something you notice and you can follow. Or like within dreams, I'll see something, and then the next day that thing will happen, or something related to it, like uncannily close to what I saw in the dream the previous night. And, that's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to work the other way when you think, from a scientific perspective. Or there's this feeling of deja vu, like you've done this thing before. In fact, in the movie The Matrix, that scene which they called a glitch was, the cat was going across and then it went across again. And that's part of what led me into looking at this, and why I was really intrigued by Philip K. Dick's speech, because he actually said, he had a situation where his wife told me that, he went into this bathroom that he had been to 100 times, and he had pulled a light switch or the chain to turn on the light and off, and the chain was no longer there, and there was a light switch instead. And it was just one of these moments, like a weird moment, like, what the hell happened? I've done this before and things are different now. And so, he came up with this whole idea that perhaps there were people changing little things and rerunning things. And when you rerun it, things might look a little bit differently each time. In fact, that's what led to his idea for a story called The Adjustment Team, which was made into a great movie called The Adjustment Bureau, with Matt Damon.
I don't know how that movie got away from people, but first of all, it's Matt Damon. A lot of people, I tell people about that. And by the way, I didn't know about it until I read your book. And we're huge Matt Damon fans. What an awesome movie.
It was a really interesting movie. And, they have this, they changed some things from his original story, but in the movie, they have these little books that are like little, like laptop, or like, like little big iPhones or whatever, but they have like these little maps, and things are changing in real time as people make decisions. And that like totally reminds me of this idea of what I call the multiverse graph, which is as you make these different decisions, you may, end up in different places. And so, I think that these glitches are an interesting part of showing that perhaps there are things going on that, we're not aware of. And science tends to ignore these glitches and say, well, yeah, that's just somebody's faulty memory. And the Mandela effect was quite interesting, because you have a group of people that remember a different timeline, right? They remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 80s or 90s. Before the internet, this wouldn't have really gotten out there, right? Because you were able to corral people who have a certain memory. Or people remember in Tiananmen Square, remember the guy in front of the tank, they call him Tank Boy, and the tank kept trying to go around. Well, many people remember him getting run over and being killed. Whereas I think in the main timeline, in the one that is the consensus reality, as Philip K. Dick might call it, he wasn't run over. Now, that really got me thinking about, are we remembering perhaps different versions of ourselves? Like there was a time many years ago when I was walking at Stanford University in the Bay Area. And when I was in high school, I wanted to either go to Stanford on the West Coast or MIT on the East Coast. I ended up going to MIT, but I had this strange vision while I was there of an alternate version of me. Like in this life, I've been an entrepreneur, video game designer. That's, where I spent my career, but a more academic version of me that was like teaching a class, some technical class. And I looked different and I was, with different people, had a different life, but it was like very vivid. And then I began to wonder, okay, is this an actual alternate timeline that might have actually played out and might have been one of these, pieces of the story that I could have chosen to follow, but I didn't in this life. And now what's interesting is years later, I did end up going to Stanford University for business school. And now I'm actually finally at the age of, 51, going back for a PhD. Whereas in that timeline, I went, when I was in my 20s, like most people do, right after they graduate. And so it's almost like, bringing together or converging of different segments of different timelines. So anyway, I think, this idea of glitches and synchronicity in particular, there's an author named Diana Pasulka, and she wrote a book called American Cosmic. And she and Jacques Vallée, who's one of the people who's a computer scientist who's been investigating UFOs going all the way back to the 1960s in Project Blue Book. If you ever saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the French scientist was actually based off of Jacques Vallée. And, they talk about this idea of a technological singularity. It's kind of like a cookie that we have in our browsers. Like, have you ever had the experience where you're shopping for something and then you go to Facebook and suddenly there's an ad for that same thing that you were shopping for on a different. Now, if you didn't know that there was this technical way to track what you had been doing, right, it would seem like magic. And that's why, scientists say, well, these synchronicities don't exist. That's just magical thinking, that because you saw this and that, there's no connection, right? But if you knew that it was a simulation or a computer program, you could see that there is actually a way for that information to be tracked. And that's what brings up, us noticing certain things during the day. So anyway, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, I think that, the glitches in the matrix are a very interesting aspect of simulation theory that often gets ignored a lot too.
I love it, man. I could listen to you talk forever. This is like my jam. Another interesting thing, and I bring this up in my book, is that like all of this conversation is usually centered around like our point of view, like as if in the simulation, we're the most important part. Like we're trying to figure out why we think the way we think and what our role is and stuff like that. But I have another theory that says that we are the like most insignificant part of the simulation. The master controller of the simulation is actually nature, and we're just an extension of it. I have this one migration theory that I came up with that says that human beings have just evolved from nature, and our purpose is just to find a way to get the hell off this planet to another planet, So anyway, so fascinating. Last question, because what's interesting about you, Riz, is that, you can go heavy with this, but you're also a very smart businessman, and he's an angel investor, and he's been involved in a lot of stuff. So I know that you are very, very much aware of the manifestation of AI, VR, but also the metaverse and crypto and NFTs. We actually have another podcast called NFTs Made Simple, because I'm fascinated with this idea that we're basically a simulation that for some reason is trying to create a simulation. So, what I find most fascinating about this, that for me is not a glitch, but it really makes me feel even more confident in the hypothesis, is that what we're seeing is that we're actually trying to create right now. And if you look at our kids, they're very comfortably moving into the metaverse. They're already in the metaverse. So yep. If you look at it from that standpoint, we're creating this simulation. Like, I think 10 years from now, you're going to be able to to get most people to agree that there is a simulation coming.
Yep.
But the idea is that maybe we're a simulation creating a simulation, and that brings up the idea that there's potentially thousands and thousands of them, turtles all the way down. So what do you think about what is happening at this? It's an interesting time for your books and all of that. And maybe that's because it's being rendered now. We're reaching some sort of new conscious level. But what do you see happening with that? And how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, I do think that this is what really got me thinking about seriously about being in a simulation, is when I laid out the stages of technology that we needed to get to, which included not just MMORPGs, not just VR and AR, but also brain computer interfaces, which we'll be able to project into our brains, kind of like in the Matrix, as well as AI that is conscious, that we're getting closer to, finally to downloadable consciousness, where you could map the neurons and the neural links of the brain and then download yourself into a computer. There's a show called Upload, which is kind of a comedy, but they're kind of moving in that direction. But my basic conclusion was we would be able to get to this point where we can create these simulations that are indistinguishable from physical reality, certainly within 100 years, maybe 200 maximum. Some people think we can get there in a couple of decades, right? And all of the stuff that you're seeing today with the metaverse and NFTs and AI, right? You may have heard of the Google engineer who thought this chatbot was sentient, right? And so there's been a big debate about, whether we're there already with sentient AI or not. I think most technologists would say we're not, but we're getting closer and closer each time. And so my point was that if we can get there in 100 years, there may be other civilizations that have already gotten there. And turns out there was a professor at Oxford named Nick Bostrom who wrote a paper all the way back in 2003 laying out what he called a simulation argument, which is that if a civilization is ever able to make these simulations, they wouldn't make just one. They would make lots and lots of them. So imagine having billions of simulated worlds, each with billions or trillions of simulated beings within them. And so he made a statistical argument that said, okay, if any civilization ever gets there, then there's going to be a hell of a lot more simulated worlds than there are physical worlds. There's only one physical world, let's say. And there's a lot more simulated beings than there are physical beings. So if you're a being in a world, which are you more likely to be? One of these, there's a lot, or one of these? He said you're more likely to be simulated. Now, that all predicated on the idea that a civilization could get there and create these sophisticated simulations. And so, it became clear to me that if we can get there within a few decades or, a century or two, imagine what a civilization that's had 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years to develop their computer systems would be able to do, which means somebody's probably already gotten there, which means there are many more simulated worlds and beings than there are physical worlds, which means you are most likely in a simulation.
Man, I know that, a lot of our listeners are just like saying like, whoa, you don't need to get high, guys. Just listen to Riz. So just one, just to kind of loop things up, and I have one final thought on this. This is his latest book, Simulated Multiverse. And, you're listening to a guy that is not only interested in this, but he's a very intelligent guy that puts a lot of his time and effort into translating this stuff to the average ordinary person. So, you will thoroughly love his books. I would start off, if you want to jump right into this, I would start off with the simulation hypothesis and then go to the multiverse. And, one of the things that I just want to wrap it up in a bow, I think the main value of the work that you're doing in this concept is that it helps us overcome one of our biggest challenges. And that is to try not to take things too serious. You mentioned before this idea of like backing up, cognitively distancing yourself from things that you perceive or receive, and maybe grabbing a more logical, rational, perception of it, thus maybe giving you a better response. So what I love about this the most is that it gives me the ability to entertain that this is a game. That doesn't scare me. It actually helps me not take things too seriously, and what you'll notice when you read Riz's books is a lot of stuff. Now you're going to have to do whatever you can to let go of whatever you were told is reality. If through religion or whatever propaganda, like if you've bought into that and you want to fight with people like us, this is not going to be good for you, right? But if you're open to the possibilities, what it'll do for you is it'll give you the ability to back up and distance yourself from something, because it'll give you something else to think about before you buy into something. And that's what your book did for me, and it does for others. So Riz, thank you so much. God, I have so many more things I want to talk to you about, but can I like officially say that maybe I'm like a friend now?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, great. That's
Simulated
all I
friend,
want to say.
right?
A simulated friend. That's right. I don't know how serious it is, but in my simulation,
Yeah.
Rizwan Virk is like one of my best friends. So thank you so much for your time. This has been wonderful. And I know everybody's going to love this. All necessary links to his books and many other books and some of his projects and his website and stuff will be in the notes. And love and appreciate everybody for listening.